This summer, students of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian backgrounds, accompanied by Wayne State University course instructor Edith Kovensky and Ben-Gurion University instructor Dr. Abed Azab, studied and traveled in Israel and the West Bank.
There's a fine distinction between a vacation and a study abroad experience. Moreover, there's a fine distinction between a study abroad experience in the Middle East and a study abroad elsewhere.
This trip was less like a study abroad and more like an immersion program.
Our study abroad course this summer was indeed an amazing experience.
It is an exceptional opportunity to view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the eyes of people on both sides.
My experience on this trip was not what I expected.
The whole experience was new, yet half the group had previously visited the region.
I had been to Israel before, but this time around it was completely different.
Prior to embarking on my trip to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, my knowledge pertaining to the lands were confined to classroom lectures and textbook readings.
I've always been interested in Israel and the conflict over there, but had been given a much skewed version of the story. Growing up Jewish and attending a Jewish temple, I never learned much about the Palestinian conflict.
Our geographical and human expense was immense. Seeing refugees west of the Jordan border, Bedouins in the West Bank and in the south of Israel, secular and religious Jews in West Jerusalem and mostly Arabs in its eastern part, Jews and Arabs in Jaffa, lay people on both sides of the borders, and Jewish and Arab performers in song and dance in Israel and in the West Bank.
They were exposed to the reality of the conflict from lectures, field trips, and interactions with Israeli and Palestinian students.
By traversing geopolitical borders and living among the people, the sights, the sounds, and the emotions of quite possibly the most looked upon and studied area on the globe, one may be quite surprised to see the clarity in which they see the conflict encountered there.
We traveled Israel from Beersheba to the Golan Heights and the West Bank from Ramallah to Bethlehem.
Visits to sites sacred to the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian religions, all in such close proximity, gave meaning to the fundamental importance of this relatively small piece of land to people of these faiths.
Being in Israel and the occupied territories also allowed me the privilege of visiting the lands holy to Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
Being able to see the Western Wall at night during a Jewish holiday was very special.
I was able to visit the Dome of the Rock, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Wailing Wall.
My roommates last year were Muslim brothers who were born in Yemen, but I still did not understand the role of religion for Muslims until I saw the Dome of the Rock.
While in Bethlehem, we visited many churches and holy sites for Christians.
The types of things we did, the places we visited, and the people we talked with were new and unique.
Crossing over the security wall for the first time was an out-of-body experience, but soon became one that I learned a great deal from, and something I am grateful for being able to do.
From lectures at both Palestinian and Israeli universities, they viewed historical events, as well as the conflict, from vastly different perspectives.
We heard lectures at the Hebrew and Ben-Gurion universities in Israel, and at Al-Quds and Bethlehem universities in the West Bank.
The part of the program that stands out to me was our 3 days at Hebrew University. Though it was a very short stay, I learned so much from the different professors. I appreciated hearing lectures based on facts rather than opinion.
The instructors at Al-Quds answered any questions we had and were willing to discuss any topic. While in Abu Dis, students from the university traveled with us. The students were not only helpful and friendly, but also allowed us to see more of the actual culture and how the people really lived. They could tell us about the checkpoints throughout the West Bank and the separate identity cards easily because it affected them every day.
I believe that I learned more in these 3 days at Hebrew University about Hebrew and the West Bank than I ever had before.
With an open ear, mind, and heart, a student who decides to take this trip could potentially find this experience to be one that impacts them tremendously.
Like when Jacob and I went to a kibbutz and had Shabbat dinner with a Jewish family who had 2 children currently serving in the military and a 12-year-old daughter at home who played piano for us. Being with this family in their home made the conversation real. This, just a few days after talking to people and seeing families in a Palestinian refugee camp and playing soccer with the kids.
During my stay, I participated in 2 demonstrations calling for peace and an end to the injustice and inequality. The first demonstration took place in the Palestinian village of Bil'ain, where foreigners and Israelis routinely join Palestinians to peacefully demonstrate against the towering wall that impedes their daily lives. The second demonstration took place in the streets of Jerusalem, where Israelis worked with Palestinians and foreigners to stop the building of Jewish settlements in illegally annexed East Jerusalem. Demonstrators powerfully chanted, "La la al-ihtilal, lo la kibush," no to the occupation. Although this compelling protest hides behind media headlines of war and violence, it revealed both people cooperating toward a peaceful coexistence.
Our diverse encounters on the ground, both in Israel and in the West Bank, taught us that dialogue is essential in overcoming the political and psychological barriers of trust, fear, and frustration.
I'd like to speak about a brief exchange with an individual while in the northern portion of Israel proper. The man I had this very brief conversation with, in spite of a clear language barrier, was an Islamic fundamentalist. He asked me if I personally was a Muslim, and I politely responded to him that I was not. He continued by saying that it wasn't possible that I was not a Muslim, for I had been so kind to him. How could this be? I replied, because I am Jewish, and he laughed, joyfully pleased with my response.
A most memorable moment for me was when I entered a music class at the Galil School in Israel and heard the kids sing in both Hebrew and Arabic. I recall being overcome by emotions of joy and utter satisfaction. The sounds and harmonies coming from this mixed group of Jewish and Arab kids gave me great hope for the future. The 8th graders, forming a circle on a bright summer morning, kept singing, "Shalom Aleichem, Salam Aleikum," meaning peace unto you. What a meaningful greeting and blessing for us now and for future generations to come.
Ever since I returned to America from our trip, people have asked me several questions like, how was it? What did you do?
It's hard to explain the Middle East Discovery Abroad trip. Not in a bad way, in fact, just the opposite.
After milling it over in my head for several weeks, I began to realize that what I experienced, what I learned, and how much my worldview changed was so profound that it took hours to sufficiently provide background information, describe my experience, and then explain what I learned to others.
It gave me the opportunity to experience current events from a primary perspective without the partiality of academia and news outlets.
I would recommend this program to anyone interested in taking a closer look at life in these territories and to someone with an open mind. Also, being able to be there with a group of Wayne State students from different educational backgrounds was phenomenal.
It was the kind of trip that made you tired yet motivated to see and do more. It was the kind of trip that inspired you to do something either in the Middle East or back here at home.
This program helped open my eyes to life in both Israel and the West Bank.
I would recommend this trip because to fully understand a situation, you have to understand the people being affected.
This trip served great purposes, both intellectually and spiritually.
At times, you heard the most ignorant things from the most jaded parents, but sometimes you would hear the most enlightening things from the children.
Coexistence is the key to the future, and through our unique study abroad course, we are bravely and carefully inching towards a better understanding of the people and their issues in Israel and in the West Bank.